Hey everybody, welcome back to day 2 of the Throne of Eldraine set review here on the Mantle Leek. I'm John, as always. We are going to take a look at all of the blue cards today. Remember, from a limited perspective, we're talking draft, we're talking sealed, we're not talking anything else here. Remember, these are my opinions. I want to hear your opinions. Everybody else wants to hear your opinions as well. That is what the comment section is for down below. As well, these are the ways that I'm going to approach these cards at the start of the format. My grades might change, my feelings on cards might change as I get more experience with them. But this is how I'm starting on them. But without further ado, let's get started on the first blue card, Animating Fairy. Animating Fairy is 2 and a blue for a creature fairy at uncommon. It's a 2/2 flyer. It has an adventure, Bring to Life. Bring to Life is 2 and a blue for a sorcery adventure. Target non-creature artifact you control becomes a 0/0 artifact creature. Put 4 +1/+1 counters on it. This card just seems solid. Early game, you'll pop this down as a 2/2 fairy without question if you don't have an artifact laying around. Windrake is just a fine card. But if you do have some artifacts kicking around, getting a 4/4 and then getting a 2/2 flyer next turn or whenever is very solid. I like this card a fair bit. I could see first picking it in a weak pack and then making sure that I have some artifacts or hopefully being in that artifact enchantment deck. I think this is a solid B. Assuming you do have some artifacts kicking around, and even if you don't, it's still like a C to C+. Great card here with Animating Fairy. Up next is Brazen Borrower. Brazen Borrower is 1 blue for a creature fairy rogue at Mythic. It's a 3/1 flash flying, and Brazen Borrower can block only creatures with flying. It has an adventure called Petty Theft. Petty Theft is 1 and a blue for an instant adventure. Return target non-land permanent an opponent controls to its owner's hand. This card's great, but it has no business being a mythic. Typically the reason people say is, oh well, it's for limited, but this could be a rare. Easily. There's no reason for this to be a mythic. Instant speed bounce is great. It can hit anything except its opponent only, so you can't use that definitely narrow case of using it defensively on one of your own things to save it. But after bouncing, you get a 3/1 flash flyer. That's awesome. That's a very aggressive creature, and if it comes down early, will cause your opponent some real problems. I think this is an easy first pick. It's not a bomb, but I think it is in the hefty B+ range. I really like Brazen Borrower. There is zero reason this should be mythic, though. Up next is Charmed Sleep. Charmed Sleep is 1 blue for an enchantment or a common enchant creature. When Charmed Sleep enters the battlefield, tap enchanted creature. Enchanted creature doesn't untap during its controller's untap step. It's Claustrophobia. I guess Claustrophobia wasn't fairy tale enough, so they changed the name to Charmed Sleep. It's very, very good removal, and as we'll see, blue's got some very good removal options this set. This is first pickable out of packs. Obviously, they can still use any activated non-tapped abilities, but that's about it. This is fantastic. It's even in the colors where enchantments matter, and blue's removal, as always, is enchantment based, so this card's just great. It's a very strong B+. I'm first picking this a whole heck of a lot. Great card. Up next is Corridor Monitor. Corridor Monitor is 1 and a blue for an artifact creature construct. It's a 1/4 at common. When Corridor Monitor enters the battlefield, untap target artifact or creature you control. No thanks. It's a 1/4, which is pretty unimpactful. Untapping a creature seems really niche at sorcery speed. The artifact part is probably the most interesting part if you are looking for some artifact synergies, but still, I think there's just generally going to be better choices. I have this as a C-. I think you cut it very regularly. C- for Corridor Monitor. Didn't Say Please is up next. Didn't Say Please is 1 blue for an instant at common. Counter target spell. Its controller puts the top 3 cards of their library into their graveyard. It's cancel, and cancel is typically not playable in draft. It's just too slow. It's too hard to cast with the blue, and you usually need some sort of really good effect on it to become good. Surveil made it good. Scry made it good, to various definitions of the word good. Milling 3, that doesn't really make this good. This is very, very, very niche case. If you are in a super duper control deck, maybe you can put one of these in. And these are typically a little bit more playable in sealed, where it's just slower and there's more chances of bomby cards since your opponent has 6 packs of rares versus 3-ish. So yeah, play in sealed if you want, and generally don't play in draft. It's like a D. D for didn't say please. Up next is Emry, Lurker of the Loch. Emry, Lurker of the Loch is 2 and a blue for a legendary creature Merfolk wizard at rare. She's a 1/2. This spell costs 1 less to cast for each artifact you control. When Emry, Lurker of the Loch enters the battlefield, put the top 4 cards of your library into your graveyard. You can tap Emry and choose target artifact card in your graveyard. You may cast that card this turn. Very helpfully in the reminder text, it tells you that timing rules still apply. So, I'm going to have to see this card played, but I'm not sold. It's only 3 mana, so reducing the cost isn't really that much of a bonus. You're not getting her out on turn 1 or turn 2. She's still going to be a turn 3 or later play. If you're heavy into artifacts, then she still probably doesn't draw 4. It's not like every card in your deck is going to be an artifact. A large chunk are lands. So I just don't know what you're getting out of her in Limited. Your artifact deck just isn't going to be jam-packed, especially because it's not an artifact deck. I do keep saying the blue-white artifact deck, but it's the blue-white artifact enchantment deck. So, I don't know. I don't know about Emry. I think she's probably a fine include in the blue-white artifact deck because she will hopefully draw you a card, and then of course if other artifacts have somehow died, perhaps artifact creatures I suppose, getting to get them back will be nice, but I'm really gonna have to see her played. I think she might be like a B- in the right deck, but I mean if you are not definitely the artifact enchantment deck and emphasis on the artifact half of that, then I think she's just an F. So I'll keep an eye on Emry. I don't know if she's going to be that good or not. Up next is Fae of Wishes. Fae of Wishes is 1 and a blue for a creature fairy wizard at rare. It's a 1/4 flyer. You can pay 1 and a blue and discard 2 cards. Return Fae of Wishes to its owner's hand. Fae of Wishes has an adventure called Granted. Granted is 3 and a blue for a sorcery adventure. You may choose a non-creature card from you own from outside the game, reveal it, and put it into your hand. That means from your sideboard. It doesn't mean from your binder or whatnot. Not a fan of this either, so here's another adventure card that's not actually a C+. Wishing is very bad in Limited, because any spell that you can cast should probably be in your deck already, not in your sideboard. And then a 1/4 flyer is pretty meh, but it is an okay sideboard option against a better flyer deck if you don't happen to have other flyers. Discarding 2 cards to return the fairy doesn't really do much, because you're not really caring about wishing again in the first place, so you're not really caring about recurring this card. I don't know. I think this card's very meh overall. I'm not generally picking this. I'm not generally main decking this. I have it as a D. I just don't really care about a 1/4. It is only 2 mana, I guess, but boy, is it ever defensive and not proactive. I'm going to go with a D. I could be wrong about it because it is only 2 mana, but I'm going to start at a D for Fae of Wishes. Up next is Fae Vandal. Fae Vandal is 1 and a blue for a creature fairy rogue at uncommon. It's a 1/2 with flash, flying, and whenever you draw your second card each turn, put a +1/+1 counter on Fae Vandal. Blue-red, of course, is the draw your second card each turn matters deck. I wish there was a name for that, but there's not. But this card just seems fine. A 1/2 flash flyer for 2 is totally fine. And if you're in the draw your second card this turn deck, then this could get decently big and be game ending. Even outside of that deck, I'm probably always main decking this as a 22nd-ish card, which means I need to go back and say that 1/4 for 2 probably is better than a D. It doesn't have flash like this one does. Let's go back and retroactively give Fae of Wishes a C, I suppose, because this card is going to get a C+ or a B- if you are in that blue-red deck. C+, B- for Fae Vandal. Up next is Folio of Fancies. Folio of Fancies is 1 and a blue for an artifact at rare. Players have no maximum hand size. Pay XX tap, each player draws X cards. Pay 2 blue tap, each opponent puts a number of cards equal to the number of cards in their hand from the top of their library into their graveyard. I don't think so. Symmetrical card draw, but I have to pay for it. good try, not falling for it. I think this is pretty much stone unplayable. The amount of mana you would have to put into this, the amount of card advantage you have to give your opponent to maybe start to look towards a mill victory is insane. Zero interest in this. This is a hard F. I'm never, ever playing Folio of Fancies. Up next is Frogify. Frogify is 1 and a blue for an enchantment aura at uncommon. Enchant creature. Enchanted creature loses all abilities and is a blue frog creature with base power toughness 1/1. Perfect. It's basically pacifism in blue. Kasmina's transmutation, people finally came around to realizing was okay-ish in War of the Spark, despite +1/+1 counters being a huge theme. Without counters being such a huge theme, there are definitely some counters floating around in this set. I think this card just gets way, way, way better. I'd pick this around where I'd pick Trapped in a Tower, and since this deals with flyers, which Trapped in a Tower does not, it might even be a little bit better. In fact, let's say it's better. B+ for Frogify. I think this card is great. Up next is Gadwick the Wizened. Gadwick the Wizened is X blue for a legendary creature human wizard at rare. It's a 3/3. When Gadwick the Wizened enters the battlefield, draw X cards. Whenever you cast a blue spell, tap target non-land permanent an opponent controls. Seems great. It's a 3/3 for 3, which is fine. A 3/3 draw a card for 4, which is okay. And anything higher than that is likely just great in the late game. Then getting to tap something down on a blue spell cast, it's a cute little bonus, but the fact that it doesn't freeze the creature makes it a little bit less impactful unless it's instants that you're casting on your opponent's turn, which you're blue, it might be. Still, all around a great creature that I would normally be the first pick in many packs. It isn't quite in the bomb range, though. I think it's just a very, very, very solid B. We'll keep it off of a B+ because of that blue casting cost. Hypnotic Sprite is up next. Hypnotic Sprite is blue for a creature fairy at uncommon. It's a 2/1 flyer. It has an adventure called Mesmeric Glare. Mesmeric Glare is 2 and a blue for an instant adventure. Counter target spell with converted mana cost 3 or less. This is cute, but I'm most likely using this just because it's a 2/1 flyer for 2. Countering CMC 3 or less is a hardish counter spell to utilize. You can very easily fall into the trap of waiting for the target and just never seeing it, whereas a 2/1 flyer on turn 2 can be very impactful. I'm slamming the creature down every single time, but in the cases where I don't maybe have the extra island yet to cast the blue, it's cute to have that counter for something, hopefully, before getting the creature. I like the card, but don't tunnel vision into having to use the adventure half. This 2/1 flyer is going to be very impactful. Get it down ASAP. Strong C+ for Hypnotic Sprite. Into the Story is up next. Into the Story is 5 blue for an instant at uncommon, but this spell does cost 3 less to cast if an opponent has 7 or more cards in their graveyard. Draw 4 cards. I'm not paying 7 for this. I'm just not. Opportunity cost 6 for the same effect and was great, but I think the difference between 6 and 7 is pretty big. Now, getting 7 cards into your opponent's library, this becomes great, but be careful. I find people frequently overestimate just how big graveyards get, just how quickly in Limited. They don't get huge too fast. I'd never expect to be casting this on turn 6 or turn 7, even with that discount. It's a little bit hard. There are definitely some cards that mill your opponent to help this out. You'll see more cards with this caring about your opponent having 7 or more cards in their graveyard effect. But just be careful. The card, I think, is still solid as long as you are going late game, have any of that mill in your deck, etc. I think it's like a B-. Instant speed super helps this out. But if you are perhaps a little bit more aggressive, if you don't quite have that late game plan, this might be a little bit too costly for you. So keep that in mind for Into the Story. The Magic Mirror is up next. The Magic Mirror is 6 blue for a legendary artifact at Mythic. This spell costs 1 less to cast for each instant and sorcery card in your graveyard. You have no maximum hand size. At the beginning of your upkeep, put a knowledge counter on the Magic Mirror, then draw a card for each knowledge counter on the Magic Mirror. If it works, it'll be pretty cool. but there isn't really an instant/sorcery deck, but the draw a second card deck, which is blue-red, will probably trend towards that, and you still have to pay blue for this at least anyways. And like that whole pay me a penny, then 2 pennies, then 3 pennies thought experiment thing where you end up with like $1 million in 1 year, you are putting a clock on yourself here. You play this on turn 7 on the play without having drawn any extra cards. You have 5 turns before you deck yourself. Ultimately, in Limited, I'm not sure I want to play this. And I think it's much more of like a commander plan. It's expensive until it's not. And if you're in that deck where you're drawing a bunch of extra cards, then this is really putting a clock on yourself really fast. So I'm going to start pretty low on this in like the D- range, only because I'm pretty sure people would yell at me if I gave it an F. D- for the Magic Mirror. Up next is Mantle of Tides. Mantle of Tides is a single blue mana for an artifact equipment at common. Equipped creature gets +1/+2. Whenever you draw your second card each turn, attach Mantle of Tides to target creature you control. Equip 3. This is interesting. I have no real idea how it'll play out. If you are in blue-red and definitely going in on the drawing a second card plan, getting an incidental equip is actually pretty good. And this is only 1 mana to cast it. This probably isn't that good, but I think I'm actually going to start out trying to play this if I am in blue-red. If you're paying to equip this, it's just bad. If that's your plan, if you're not in blue-red, this card is unplayable. It's super bad, like a lot of equipment often is, especially at common. But if you are in that blue-red deck, I'm actually going to start this out at like a C or even a C+ and give it a try. Could be it's still just not worth it and there's better stuff you can do, especially when you're drawing so many extra cards, but we'll see how it goes. Tentative C+ for Mantle of the Tides in a specific deck. Otherwise, don't touch it. Merfolk Secretkeeper is up next. Merfolk Secretkeeper is a single blue mana for a creature Merfolk Wizard at common. It's an 0/4 with flavor text. It has an adventure called Venture Deeper. Venture Deeper is a single blue mana for a sorcery adventure. Target player puts the top 4 cards of their library into their graveyard. So you can mill yourself or your opponent for 4. I'm not sold on this card. An 0/4 for 1 is not good. I never play Yoke Docks. I never have interest in that. Out of the sideboard, maybe. Against some decks, it's not the worst sideboard card. It's like a D. A single blue mana to mill your opponent. If you are desperately caring about your opponent having 7 cards in their graveyard, which some blue cards do care about, I could arguably see this card getting included. If you're looking to mill yourself, there are some reasons to do that. I can't bring myself to say that I reasonably see this being included. I don't like this card. I think it's like a D. I think there are some very niche cases for it, and I think there's a certain sideboard use case for it, but I think it's just a D for Merfolk Secretkeeper. If you want one, you should be able to get one. Probably just last pick. D for Merfolk Secretkeeper. Up next is Midnight Clock. Midnight Clock is 2 and a blue for an artifact at rare. Tap it to add a blue. Pay 2 and a blue, put an hour counter on Midnight Clock. At the beginning of each upkeep. Ooh, I didn't read that. Each upkeep, put an hour counter on Midnight Clock. When the 12th hour counter is put on Midnight Clock, shuffle your hand and graveyard into your library, then draw 7 cards. Exile Midnight Clock. I really like this. I really like it, and I hope the format is friendly enough to it. Note that you don't have to tap it to put the hour counter on it, which means it can help pay for one of those counters itself. It can tap for one of those blue, and it's just a solid mana sink as the game goes on. And as I just read, it's every upkeep. That's your opponent's upkeep and your upkeep. It's not actually going to take very long to hit the midnight hour here. And then you shuffle your graveyard back in. That's a cool little bonus. And draw 7? I'm going to start really high on this card and actually first pick it after removal until I learn differently. I'm going to start this at a B+. I think this card's actually great. I think you will hit midnight relatively fast, and just having something to do with your mana is a huge bonus. So B+ for Midnight Clock. I hope this card is great. Up next is Mirrormade. Mirrormade is 1 blue for an enchantment at rare. You may have Mirrormade enter the battlefield as a copy of any artifact or enchantment on the battlefield. Obviously, very super deck dependent. You'll know if it's good or not. I'd want to have at least 3 or 4 good targets for this. Having a target is not good enough. If I'm copying a gingerbread man, or if I'm copying a food with this, it's not good enough. You need to have good targets in your deck and a number of them. If you do, I think it's a pretty solid card, obviously in blue-white. There is also the cool little bonus mode of this where you're blue something, this is in your sideboard, and your opponent has some really cool artifacts or enchantments. In that case, you could maybe side this in against them, and it could be good there. But other than those 2 situations, it's an F. You just shouldn't play it. But if you have enough stuff, it's kind of like a B. Play it when you should, don't when you shouldn't. Mistford River Turtle is up next. Mistford River Turtle is 3 and a blue for a creature turtle at common. It's a 1/5. Whenever Mistford River Turtle attacks, another target attacking non-human creature can't be blocked this turn. I want to dislike this. 1/5s don't really interest me, but it's kind of like a Pegasus Courser that just costs 1 more, right? And has 2 extra toughness, but doesn't fly. But explicitly, if you have a non-human attacking, which is obviously less good than a Pegasus Courser. So it is way more deck dependent. It depends on how non-human you are. Now, blue is one of the more non-human colors. Red-green is where it specifically really is big. But I don't know. I think I'm actually going to start at like a B- on this. It might just be that good. It might just be as good or better than Pegasus Courser. So I'm gonna cautiously start on a B-. I could definitely see it actually going up a bit, and I could see it just not being as good because it doesn't fly, because it doesn't hit your humans, because it costs 4 mana, etc. But let's start at a B- on this and see which way it goes. Up next is Moonlit Scavengers. Moonlit Scavengers is 5 and a blue for a creature Merfolk Rogue at common. It's a 4/5. When Moonlit Scavengers enters the battlefield, if you control an artifact or enchantment, return target creature an opponent controls to its owner's hand. Obviously, this is very deck dependent. If you are not the artifact or enchantment deck, this is probably just an F. Nobody's playing a 6 mana 4/5 ever. And even if you are the blue-white artifact enchantment deck, or you for whatever reason have a whole bunch of them in your blue whatever deck, I still don't think I'm playing this. 6 mana is a lot of mana for a 4/5 with no evasion, no flying, no trample, no nothing. So yeah, even getting the bounce ability off of this, I don't think it's worth 6 mana. I'm super strongly never wanting to play this card. It's like a D- to me. I would have to be just utterly desperate for a creature to ever put this in my deck. D- for Moonlit Scavengers. Mystical Dispute is up next. Mystical Dispute is 2 and a blue for an instant at uncommon. This spell costs 2 less to cast if it targets a blue spell. Counter target spell unless its controller pays 3 generic mana. This is a cycle. There are a bunch of spells, not a bunch, there's 1 in each color, that is cheaper or different if it targets its own color. So Convolute is a card that I play sometimes. It's not good, but it's sometimes okay as like a 23rd card. Just be aware you have to use it fast. Late game, it falls off very hard and frequently will be an absolutely dead card in your hand where your opponent just has enough mana that paying 3 is not a problem. The cute bonus of this against a blue deck, possibly getting to use it earlier or double spell in your turn, is nice, and I'd feel happy signing it in against a blue deck. So I'm probably going to go in like the C- range. I'm going to play it like Convolute, where I cut it if I can, but I'm going to remember if it's in my sideboard for that blue mirror match, where I think it actually will be an almost auto sideboard include, I think. So C- for Mystical Dispute, but remember you have it. Up next is my preview card, Opt. Opt is a single blue mana for instant at common. It says scry 1 and draw a card. Very simple, very clean. It's not great. It's not even necessarily playable in a good number of cases. You'll just have better cards. But if you're looking for a 23rd card, it's not the worst. It helps you keep some sketchy hands. And if you're looking to draw a second card in a turn, perhaps you're in blue-red, this is a super cheap way to get that synergy. This card, I think, is just a C. I think you can cut it reliably if you want to, and I think you can include it if you want to as well. A C for Opt. Up next is Overwhelmed Apprentice. Overwhelmed Apprentice is a single blue mana for a creature, human, wizard at uncommon. It's a 1/2. When Overwhelmed Apprentice enters the battlefield, each opponent puts the top 2 cards of their library into their graveyard, then you scry 2. I really like this card. I think a 1/2 for 1 that scries 2 is fantastic. Milling 2 is pretty mediocre. There are, as I said, some cards, we've seen 1 or 2, that care about your opponent having 7 cards in the graveyard, but still it's kind of neither here or nor there. But this card is just solid value. It's not massively impactful. It's not going to blow open games. It's not going to end games. It's not even really doing synergy. It's just really good value packed into a 1-drop. I think it's the strongest of C pluses we've ever seen. I'm not going to go up to a B- on this. I don't think I'd ever first pick this card, but I think it's a very strong C+ for Overwhelmed Apprentice. Up next is Queen of Ice. Queen of Ice is 2 and a blue for a creature, human, noble, wizard at common. She's a 2/3. Whenever Queen of Ice deals combat damage to a creature, tap that creature. It doesn't untap during its controller's next untap step. She can also go on an adventure first if she wants. Rage of Winter. Rage of Winter is 1 and a blue for a sorcery adventure. Tap target creature. It doesn't untap during its controller's next untap step. Queen of Ice looks totally fine. Rage of Winter, I wouldn't necessarily play on its own. I would want to draw a card or something, or I would want it to be instant speed. But the fact that it comes with a 2/3 for 3, which also does that ability on damage, is pretty good. This is going to stop a lot of attackers that have less than 3 power, and it's going to potentially even for 1 turn chump and give you an extra turn. It could also potentially be a kind of an annoying attacker. All in all, Queen of Ice looks totally fine. I think she's a super solid C+. I might even push her up to a B-. I'm not certain on that, but let's go with a very strong C+ for Queen of Ice. Up next is Runaway Together. Runaway Together is 1 and a blue for an instant at common. Choose 2 target creatures controlled by different players. Return those creatures to their owner's hands. This is basically Aether Tradewinds with some differences only in multiplayer. In 1v1 draft, it's just Aether Tradewinds. This card's quite decent. 2 mana, instant speed, bounce a creature is nice, and while you do have to bounce one of yours as well, you can hopefully re-trigger an ETB, save a creature from being a tower, or being in a tower, or being a frog, or even just return a small creature that you can easily recast to double spell the next turn. It's a solid card. I'd recommend not sleeping on this. Knowing that this is good at the start of the format will help you out a very good bit. There will be some times where you don't have a creature on the board, and so you can't actually cast this, and that'll suck. And that's why this is only going to be a B-, but it's still a good card. B- for Runaway Together. Up next is Sage of the Falls. Sage of the Falls is 4 and a blue for a creature, Merfolk, wizard at uncommon. It's a 2/5. Whenever Sage of the Falls or another non-human creature enters the battlefield under your control, you may draw a card. If you do, discard a card. 5 mana, 2/5 loot is not good enough. Looting on non-humans entering the battlefield, I mean, I guess, but it's like turn 6 or later. That's powerfully not my jam. I can't imagine this actually being an overly decent card, even in the draw 2 cards a turn deck. It's way too much mana. It's way too little impact for me. I'm going to start this at a D. It needs to be cheaper, I think. I need this to be like a 4 mana 2/4 or something. At 5 mana, I'm pretty out on this. A D for Sage of the Falls. Up next is So Tiny. So Tiny is a single blue mana for an enchantment aura at common. It's got flash, enchant creature. Enchanted creature gets -2/-0. Gets -6/-0 as long as its controller has 7 or more cards in their graveyard. This card's fantastic. A single blue mana for instant speed, power, draining is real good value. -2/-0 in limited will functionally turn off a good amount of attackers, or at least heavily hamper them. And as the game goes on, the card actually scales in power level. Draw this late game, there's a decent chance that it's -6/-0, which will shut off basically everything. Don't sleep on this. People will absolutely say, oh, but the creature can block. Its abilities can still be activated. It's not that good. But it is good. This is like Chant of the Skiff Sang from Dark Ascension. I'm starting this at a B. This card is great. B for So Tiny. Steelgaze Griffin is up next. Steelgaze Griffin is 4 and a blue for a creature Griffin at common. It's a 2/4 flyer. Whenever you draw your second card each turn, Steelgaze Griffin gets +2/+0 until end of turn. You need to be real confident you're drawing your second card every turn. A 2/4 flyer for 5 is not terribly playable. A 4/4 is fine to good. So yeah, if you're absolutely certain that you're doing this, you are the blue-red deck, you are definitely drawing cards a lot, then this is a C+. If you're not, it's a very cuttable C-. So C+, C-, depends on the deck. It's not great. You're not going out of your way to play this anyways. Steelgaze Griffin, C+, C-. Stolen by the Fae is up next. Stolen by the Fae is X blue for a sorcery at rare. Return target creature with converted mana cost X to its owner's hand. You create X 1/1 blue fairy creature tokens with flying. I can't tell if this is good. It's probably good, but maybe it's just not good. It's not X or less, which is very important. You can't make 7 fairies unless you're bouncing explicitly a 7-drop, which there are some, but not many. So this isn't even really a mana sink spell late game. If I'm bouncing anything less than a 4-drop, am I happy? I don't know. I'm really confused by this card. I'm starting out thinking it reads way better than it is. We'll see if the 1/1 flyers are impactful, but not knowing how many you'll get because it depends entirely on what your opponent has on the board, being sorcery speed, these all feel like pretty big strikes against it for me. I'm going to start it at like a C, and I'm going to start thinking that it's not actually very good. We'll see where it goes. But boy, I think not being instant speed and not being X or less, I think is some really big hits against this. So let's go for a C for Stolen by the Fae. Up next is Sir Eleanor the Discerning. Sir Eleanor is 3 blue for a legendary creature human knight at uncommon. She's a star 4. Sir Eleanor the Discerning's power is equal to the number of cards in your hand. When Sir Eleanor enters the battlefield, draw a card. Spells your opponent's cast that target Sir Eleanor cost 2 more to cast. It's a 5 mana 1/4 that draws a card. At least. And it's expensive to target. It's not great. If it's a 2/4, we're getting into fairly okay range, and it's a knight, but it is outside of the Mardu colors, so that's not probably a big deal. But if you do have any more cards in your hand, if you're drawing cards, perhaps if you're blue-red in the multi-draw card deck, she's just going to be straight up good. The second she's a 3/4, I think she's pretty solid, and anything better than that's just going to be gravy. Being a legendary could help, potentially. Being a knight could help, potentially, as I said, but both of those things aren't really heavily in blue. But yeah, I think Sir Eleanor is just fine. I think she's like a solid B- for what she is. B- for Sir Eleanor. Up next is Tome Raider. Tome Raider is 2 and a blue for a creature fairy at common. It's a 1/1 flyer. When Tome Raider enters the battlefield, draw a card. 3 mana for a 1/1 flyer is pretty rough, but drawing a card probably just makes it worth it. In blue-red, this is great, probably sitting around a strong C+. Outside of blue-red, I think it might still actually be a C+, just a little bit weaker. It's obviously not Cloudkin Seer. It doesn't have the tribal synergy that Cloudkin Seer had. It's not a 2/1 like Cloudkin Seer was, but I think it's still decent. So a C+ for Tome Raider. Up next is Turn Into a Pumpkin. Turn Into a Pumpkin is 3 and a blue for an instant at uncommon. Return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. Draw a card. Adamant, if at least 3 blue mana was spent to cast this spell, create a food token. I love this card. 4 mana, instant speed bounce, draw a card, maybe make a food. Sold, super sold, sell me more copies of it. I love this card. I'll first pick it and you can't stop me. Obviously, it's only around like a B-, but this is just a card that does everything that I want to do. I love this card. I'm going to pick it as often as I possibly can. B- for Turn Into a Pumpkin. Up next is Unexplained Vision. Unexplained Vision is 4 and a blue for a sorcery. Draw 3 cards. Adamant, if at least 3 blue mana was spent to cast this spell. Scry 3. It's a little bit weird that you scry after the draw. That's kind of unfortunate. Sorcery speed is kind of unfortunate. I think this only goes into certain decks. You need to make sure that taking turn 5 or 6 off just to draw some cards is something that you're able to do. If you can, This is probably okay. It's like a C+. I don't think I'd really want a second one, but it's probably fine. But I think some blue decks just won't really want this. They can't take turn 5 off like this. So C+ in certain decks, other decks, maybe like a C- for Unexplained Vision. Ventress Gargoyle is up next. Ventress Gargoyle is 1 and a blue for an artifact creature Gargoyle at rare. It's a 5/4 flyer. Ventress Gargoyle can't attack unless defending player has 7 or more cards in their graveyard. Ventress Gargoyle can't block unless you have 4 or more cards in hand. Tap. Each player puts the top card of their library into their graveyard. I read the attack block clauses reversed at first and thought this card was insane. Still, it seems pretty darn decent. You'll hopefully be able to have 7 cards in their graveyard by maybe turn 6 or so. As long as creatures died, they cast spells, you tapped this, at which point you have a 5/4 flyer, which is pretty balmy, especially since you only put 2 mana into it. And until then, this thing will be blocking like a champ until you're down to 4 cards or less, which typically isn't till around turn 4, turn 5 or so. Still, there is some finickiness in this where you may just run out of cards too quickly and it can't attack or block, or your opponent may just not get cards in their graveyard as quickly as you want. You're stuck putting 1 in a turn. But I think this is still very powerful. I'm going to start out first picking it at a B+. I think it can be very, very good. A 5/4 flyer is going to be terrifying if this thing can attack. B+ for Ventress Gargoyle, possibly a bit high, but we'll start at a B+. Ventress Paladin is up next. Ventress Paladin is 3 and a blue for a creature human knight. It's got flying. It's a 2/2. It has adamant if at least 3 blue mana was spent to cast the spell. Ventress Paladin enters the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter on it. Yeah, this is pretty standard. A 2/2 flyer for 4 is very, very cuttable. It's like a C-. If you're definitely getting a counter on this, it's fine. It's better than a Snapping Drake. It's a 3/3 for 4. It's like a C, maybe a C+, but let's go with a C on Ventress Paladin. But yeah, if you are not heavy blue, if you are much less blue than you are your other color, this is much more of a C-. Our second last blue card is Wishful Merfolk. Wishful Merfolk is 1 and a blue for a creature Merfolk at common. It's a 3/2 with Defender. Pay 1 and a blue. Wishful Merfolk loses Defender and becomes a human until end of turn. 3/2 Defender is not great, even for 2 mana. Dies to a 1-drop that exists in this format that we saw. Paying to attack isn't great either. This is close to Returned Phalanx from Theros, which was actually decent, but that was a 3/3. And a 3/3 is very different than a 3/2. Ultimately, I'm not really looking to play this. It's basically a, hey, look, we made the Little Mermaid card, rather than an actual playable card. This is a hefty C-. In fact, I'm going to drop that right down to a D. D for Wishful Merfolk. I just think by the time you're paying the 2 mana to activate this, a 3/2 is not really what you want. And it doesn't even block that well as a defender. So a D for Wishful Merfolk. Our last blue card is Witching Well. Witching Well is a single blue mana for an artifact at common. When Witching Well enters the battlefield, scry 2. Pay 3 and a blue and sacrifice Witching Well. Draw 2 cards. This seems all around okay. No one thing about this card is good or worth playing, but being only 1 mana and scrying 2 and being 4 mana to draw 2 cards at instant speed, being an artifact in one of the artifact colors, these all come together to make a card that I think you probably don't hate playing. It's not super good. I'm not highly picking this, and I'm not even necessarily always playing it, but I think I do want to go with a C+. So I'm feeling generous. Let's go with a C+ for Witching Well. I think all of the little medium things about this card put together make it an actually fine card. C+ for Witching Well. So that's going to wrap it up for blue. Blue looks interesting. There is bounce. There is actually pretty good blue removal with Frogify and the other one, So Tiny. I'm looking forward to playing blue. I'm really looking forward to playing blue-red specifically for that draw 2 cards a turn deck That sounds exactly like the way that I like to play Limited. So yeah, let me know what you're excited about in blue, what cards you are excited to play with, what cards you agree with my ratings, disagree with my ratings, etc. in the comments down below. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, you can find me over on Twitter, Twitch, and Facebook. You can find me at patreon.com/themanaleak if you want to become a backer there. The patrons over there are the best people. They are absolutely keeping this channel going strong. You could also help yourself out and help me out by going over to inkedgaming.com and using the promo code MANALEAK10, all one word, 10 as the number, to get 10% off your order and to help out the channel. And of course, the easiest way, thumbs up, subscribe, share. But if you do have questions, comments, or suggestions, let me know. Otherwise, I will see you all tomorrow for the black set review.